Thanks, Liz, and happy to follow in Damon's footsteps. He plowed through a heck of a lot of content, so I'm going to march to that same beat of the drum, and we're going to move quickly through a number of different areas. True to form, I told Liz earlier, threw slides together at the last minute. There's so many different things that we could cover in regards to optimizing silage quality. Given a couple of talks at conferences in the not too distant future, Midwest Forage Association next week. Look for Damon and I on the program there. Come find us. Perhaps throw something at me if you don't agree with everything we talk about today. And then also going to be speaking on innovative developing silage management trends, quality assessment down in Florida at the Ruminant Nutrition Symposium in a couple of weeks. And so some of the content, some of the ideas, it's not that anything is dramatically new this year, but continuing to sharpen the sword, so to speak. And I'll offer a little bit of a vision as to why I think we need to keep getting sharper and sharper and sharper, starting right here. I mean, so going beyond just hypothetically speaking, or from an academic perspective, we all realize desire and hopefully are seeking to do better day in, day out. Though the dairy industry in Wisconsin and throughout the U.S. at the moment is in a very strong financial position. So milk prices have been pretty strong. Income over feed costs the last couple of quarters has been pretty good. And I like to and subscribe to Mark Linsmeyer's Margin Smart. And there's a number of newsletters such as this that exist out there. But what my aim and intention is here is to project out or reference Mark's projections based on class three corn and beans into the next 12 calendar months. And this graphic to me signifies that we have strong financial potential on the horizon, and we need to do everything we can in optimizing our plan of nutrition. And that starts with, as Damon led in, putting a high quality crop while planting a crop with potential, protecting that through the season, harvesting that high quality crop, and then sorting out how to feed it to its full potential. So I'm going to offer a couple of comments along those lines, and I'll be here for questions and discussion today. This again is the next 12 calendar months, and the red line, as you see here, that's break even. So we've been bouncing around break even the last 18 to 20 years, but you can see that margin projections the next 4 quarters as summarized by the last few weeks of future prices are looking pretty strong, somewhere between a dollar and $3 per hundredweight, and that is fantastic. Our dairy producers need this margin potential in return. In terms of where are we going, I'll reflect a little bit on 2024. I'm going to speak to some interactions between agronomy and nutrition. This is more due to Mother Nature, but we can take home some points with regards to soil fertility and nitrogen. Talk perhaps a little bit about how to optimize 24's feeding potential and then setting our goals for 25. I don't know if we need to necessarily make any strategy adjustments today in terms of feeding 24, but certainly as we look out to 25 and evaluating seed genetics, management practices, I want to lay a couple of ideas out and hopefully core concepts in terms of how to appropriately evaluate not only our silage hybrids, but also different feed management practices, crop protection practices, et cetera. And then I'd be remiss if we didn't touch on feed hygiene, especially following in Damon's footsteps, talking about mycotoxins. There's a bit more than mycotoxins that can unfortunately plague cattle. So building upon the margin projection slide, I'll throw this at us maybe from a little bit different perspective. When we look at and invest a couple hundred thousand, maybe $250,000 in say a piece of equipment or a tract of hunting land, we go through a fair bit of due diligence. But I don't think that we always realize the economic investment that goes into our silage. And I've gone through this math a couple of times in the last few years. For every 500 cows on feed, we're investing somewhere in the neighborhood of $250,000 in our corn silage from the time we buy the seed, prep the soil, apply our fertilizer plan, crop protections through harvest, get it under plastic. We've got $250,000 invested in that feed. That is a huge feed cost and one that I want to continue to push aggressively to optimize that investment. In terms of optimizing the investment, and one thing I talk about in the proceedings for Florida, there are a number of different ways that we can look at forage quality. We talk a lot about fiber digestibility, and we certainly will today again, but really I want to drive a total digestible nutrient mindset and speaking in terms of milk per ton, milk per acre, looking at that energetic value per ton of feed. So our colleague, Professor Federico, has released and worked on with Cold Deep Pursuit the Milk 2024 model, which takes into account different nutrient measurements, different nutrient digestibilities to drive some energy outcome. But we can drive higher energy value silage, yes, in part with increasing fiber digestibility, but we can also drive higher quality silage with more starch or more digestible starch. And that all combines into this total digestible nutrient metric. And every unit increase or pound more TDN we can bring into the diet brings enough energy for 3.5 pounds of energy corrected milk. And so that's certainly of big economic value as we laid out before. In the case of corn silage, the TDN is driven by, yes, fiber digestibility, like I mentioned a couple of times. But one of the points I want to drive home is that we have to take into account starch to fiber levels. And this is really grain to stover ratios. So for our agronomists on the call, we may look at grain yields, but starch and fiber that nutritionists will look at on a feed analysis report are really directly tied to grain to stover ratios. So we can have short statured corn like we'll hear about just in a minute, that may have a higher starch level just due to more grain and less stover. And then secondarily, we want to look at the nutrient digestibility, such as fiber and starch digestibility. And this TDN is a function of the nutrient content and nutrient digestibility. So total digestible nutrients, milk per ton, is not just fiber digestibility, but it's starch, fiber and starch digestibility, all summed up into one index value. And this is how we really need to be evaluating silage, not just strictly fiber digestibility. When I look then at feeding potential and moving beyond just the energetic potential in feed, the particle size, and I've got a slide or two to speak to that in the case of starch, but also the particle size of fiber will influence the feeding value and feeding potential in silage and ultimately influence our dairy cow's response because we can have great silage feeding potential in terms of a lab analysis that is done on a ground sample, ground to smithereens, and analyzed for nutritional potential. But if that grain is not processed effectively or that fiber isn't processed appropriately, and that interacts negatively within the rumen environment, we may not recognize anywhere close to the full energetic potential. So I want to see us continue to focus on both kernel processing score, but probably also revisit this concept of fiber particle size, especially with some of today's more healthy plants. Again, following Professor Smith's lead and looking at maybe seed genetics and hybrids that are a bit more resistant. I think we can stretch out our fiber particle size a little bit longer than we have classically, just because we have more digestible fiber on the average. And I'll skip past these couple of slides. This is an example of today's nutritional analysis from Rock River, for example, but a lot of metrics on here and just driving home the point of not only fiber, but also starch digestibility and nutrient, total digestible nutrients. Let's talk a little bit about the interaction between the growing environment and genetics, and really the importance of agronomic practices, and then a little bit that growing environment as well. So we can't control Mother Nature. Mother Nature has thrown us some curveballs the last couple of years. We've had very different growing seasons in the upper Midwest in 23. It was quite dry to start the year, and then we got saving grains and ended up with really good quality silage in the case in terms of both starch and grain yields were average, and then that fiber digestibility potential was excellent, corresponding to drought earlier in the year. In 24, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, the script flipped. So that's one thing that was outside of our influence. But one thing that we realized, and I'll have a graphic speaking to this, is that the grain hardness, the test weight, or the rumen starch digestibility, these are all sort of synonymous or correlated together. Looks to be quite a bit higher this year for silage, and so speaking to the impact that agronomy can have, I don't expect, nor am I portraying that we decreased our nitrogen fertilization and we were substandard in terms of our fertility plans early last year. But with the amount of rainfall that we got, and maybe coupled with just the stature or short statured nature to the roots, I don't think had the same kind of nitrogen uptake in last year's crop, and we saw some interesting outcomes. So we can think about that from an agronomic practices and management standpoint, because I'm starting to better understand while we always are looking for more research relating fertility and crop protection practices to resulting yield and quality. Nitrogen looks to be influencing our grain both our grain yield, but also our grain hardness. And then I think some other macronutrient applications that have potential to influence fiber quality as well. So let's keep pushing the envelope there and do some research together. Let's look at 2024 outcome, looking at Rockefeller Laboratory database outcomes for silage samples categorized into crop year. So we've got 2021 crop year on the bottom and 2024 crop year on the top. These are population bell curves, if you will, or distribution charts. So there are three horizontal black lines within each crop year. Those correspond to the 15th, the 50th, and the 85th percentile. For whatever parameter we are looking at. I've got a few slides that'll look like this. This is starch content, which again is pretty much the grain relative to the stover. So we had pretty average levels of starch the last couple of years, despite having very different growing seasons. However, the starch was quite a bit different. Starch and fiber will offset one another, so I don't have the fiber graphic in the slide today. But fiber levels in our silage were pretty average because the more grain we have, the more starch we have, the less fiber we're going to have, or vice versa. The fiber digestibility, and I think I pulled out the slide from Professor Lauer, who's now retired and has done some great work. But that the early season rainfalls we had last year seem to have imprinted our crop, our growing crop, to the point that it lignified a little bit more, and we have less digestible fiber. So I'm looking at Professor Combs' TTNDFD metric here, which accounts for a number of different fiber digestibility facets in silage, and we dropped off by probably 5 to 7. Not units, but 5 to 7% of fiber digestion potential, and it it's having an effect. I mean, just the feeding and intake potential of silage this year is a little bit off, corresponding to this little bit lower fiber digestibility, which is strictly Mother Nature. I don't think this was plant health at all. It was just that early season rainfall. In terms of the impact that this fiber digestibility can have, I was scouring through some slides last minute, and I stumbled upon this slide, which is dated at this point, about 5 years old, but I think does a nice job. This was from an internship survey of Jared Geiser, and then I think we might have put this in an abstract. Good PhD of me here, referencing back to the originating work. But consider this just kind of a survey work, not implying cause and effect, but we've got several different fiber digestibility measurements on the x-axis of this graphic, and then we see energy corrected milk for dairies in eastern Wisconsin, and this would have been done in 2018. So again, I'm not implying cause and effect, but I think we can grasp when we look at the corn silage undigestible fiber digestibility. So the greater the fiber digestibility, whether we look at Combs TT&DFD metric or a more classic NDF digestibility at 30 hours, we tend to see a little bit higher energy corrected milk in those herds. Whereas this is a newer measurement in animal nutrition over the last 5 to 7 years. We're looking at undigested fiber at 240 hours in the rumen. Think of this like just concrete or rebar in terms of it's never digested. There's a portion of fiber that will never be digested in dairy cows, and we see a negative relationship in the silage UNDF. So UNDF is it will also increase as Damon talked about before. If we think back to that lignin metric and that heavily tar spotted conditions, we saw that lignin number increase. So in addition to feed hygiene and deoxynivalenol and vomitoxin concerns, we can also realize pretty substantial negative effects and feeding potential corresponding to plant disease. So I'm continuing to emphasize our incentive to go after both scouting and considering crop protection practices this year. This is an outcome or a correlation that I spoke about earlier. So let's just assume that maybe the nitrogen was mobilized and utilized a little bit differently in this past year's crop. This is rumen starch digestibility at 7 hours. So this is the lab metric that gives us some idea of the grain feeding potential, just how fermentable, how digestible, how soft that starch is. And we're seeing a notable increase in the corn silage rumen starch digestibility for the upper Midwest this year. And I think that corresponds to our growing season and just how nitrogen was utilized, and maybe a little lighter test weight with nitrogen not being maybe available or taken up to the extent it was in the past. And I keep talking about nitrogen in the grain because for grain hardness and higher test weight corn to come about, it needs nitrogen, it needs protein, and nitrogen are the building blocks for amino acids and proteins. I spoke a little bit about the importance not only of the nutritional analysis, the nutrient values and digestibility, but also the processing. So kernel processing score has been a longstanding bedrock of lab analyses, and we've shifted the goal higher a little bit. So the goals for kernel processing score are around 75 to 80%. So the top 15 percentiles analyzed by the laboratory are hitting 75 to 80%. So if you haven't done one of these in a while, consider checking it out. Or if you have done one, are you hitting that 75%? If not, there's possibly a little bit more potential we can get out of our silage. So this is continues to be something we can talk about in years to come. As far as strategy of feeding out the 24 silage, so we not only had heavier rainfall earlier in the year and then it changed, but we had a wider distribution to our planting dates, and we saw just extreme heterogeneity in our growing crop that ultimately was harvested and put under plastic. So I'll move through this pretty quickly, but hopefully can make the point. If we compare and contrast a sighting and a rifle, and I ask you, is this rifle with a new Vortex optics sighted in with just one sight or one shot, we might say, yeah, we're good to go. However, if we take a few more shots, we realize, nope, we're not actually where we need to be. So we make some adjustments. So one thing we're seeing dairy producers and nutritionists do a little bit more so this year is get a little bit more aggressive with their feed sampling regimen just to uh, dial in their silage a little bit more and finding and uncovering some variants in feed that we didn't necessarily know existed based on our traditional feed sampling regimen. So if you're only testing every couple of months, maybe do it once a month. If you're doing once a month, maybe every couple of weeks, depending on the feed you're moving through. All right, let's transition now. So I'm feeling a little bit under the weather. I was texting Damon, my kids brought some stuff home, and I think he'll maybe chuckle with me. If you stick your finger up your nose, you're going to get sick. And so let's transition from talking about the nutritional value and particle size attributes of silage to talking about some anti-nutritional characteristics and really dovetailing from what Damon was talking about in terms of mycotoxins. We have issues in silage and not just mycotoxins. Cows know. We don't always see it with our eyes, but cows know. This is an example from a picture from Australia doing some fence line feeding. And for whatever reason, this cow here was willing to risk electric shock and go for some feed down here, despite having this feed right in front of her up high. There must have been some anti-nutritional characteristics in this feed. If we get silage that's contaminated to some extent with mycotoxins or mold and yeast, it's not only going to make animals sick, but it can also rob us of energetic value. And speaking from personal experience today, I've got a little bit of viral thing going on, and I am just one, I don't feel that great, but two, my energy is nowhere close to where it needs to be, and that is because my immune system is turned on, and there's an energy draw associated with that. So not only can animals get sick if we don't do a good job in putting up healthy feed, but we can also probably rob the diet of potential and like corn grain feeding value. So it's going to be really important heading into this year to do everything we can to grow and harvest healthy plants. And then, like Damon said, harvest at the correct time, ferment with all the tools in our toolboxes to preserve every bit of digestible feed and avoid feed out instability concerns and optimize then the feeding potential relative to harvest. And recognize that while Damon and we were talking about fungal disease and mycotoxins, epiphytic yeast or spoilage yeast, as well as undesirable bacteria can also be present in feed that would then interact with, say, nutritional stressors or perhaps management and environmental stressors. So we've been running through some pretty cold weather as of late, and all of these factors can contribute synergistically, unfortunately, to animal health or performance issues. I'll skip past this slide, but I like this picture because it details how we may have clean feed, for example, from a mycotoxin standpoint, but I like to use infrared cameras. I've used thermal imaging in the past to identify feed hygiene issues. And so as yeast grow, they create heat. And here we can see visibly clean feed for the naked eye, but all of a sudden, if we unlock an infrared camera and see some temperatures, we see that we've got some issues here. So that's what we want to avoid. I'm going to skip past this because I think I'm about running out of time. If you'd like to reach out and talk a little bit about hybrid evaluation, other ways to evaluate crop management practices, we can do that.